This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is David Stockman. For those that follow business and politics in the United States of America, it's a name that you will probably recall. David has been a businessman. He has been a congressman. And he was also director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Ronald Reagan. What really grabbed my attention, the main reason I wanted to have David on, two reasons. His book, The Great Deformation, The Corruption of Capitalism in America, and his comments about President Woodrow Wilson. David brings just an amazing amount of detail to politics, economics, business. And I got to tell you, he is going to make some people on the left angry. He's going to make some people on the right angry. He's going to make those that support welfare angry. He's going to make those that support warfare angry. And as a side note, the main reason I am speaking with David is because all of these years ago, the editor on my first two books, a great lady named Celia Strauss, and Celia really taught me a lot about writing. She taught me a lot about the process of how to go about it. Not necessarily from conversations, even from just watching how she thinks, how she thought on my books, how she could assist me to think about my writing. Great stuff. I'm forever grateful to her insights. But Celia has always been good friends with David, and even going back in time, when I was just a no-name guy, 2003, 2002, and Celia and her family, her husband, they've been pretty successful people, and they've always been friends with David Stockman. And she would always tell me, it's like, what a great guy, you know. I didn't have a podcast at the time or anything like that. So all these years later, nearly like 12 years later, since I think when I first met Celia, I'm now having David Stockman on the show. I hope you enjoy my conversation today with David Stockman. I first wanted to say something off the top. I thought the Woodrow Wilson piece was just fantastic. As a guy in my mid-40s, to read that retrospective was just an amazing thesis to look at that and really ponder it. And I want to dive into some of that and let you give some historical analysis to the audience. But I thought a great place to start was just to get your emotion and your feeling on the statement that I had in mind. And the statement I had in mind is I'm thinking back to the fall of 2008, and I'm thinking that the fear was palpable that the ATMs would not work. And at the same time, we were having a bailout of a private hedge fund called Goldman Sachs. Those two things were related, weren't they? I'd love to have your take on that idea that the ATM not working fear in the fall of 2008, and at the same time, we were basically bailing out a hedge fund called Goldman Sachs. I still don't think that's properly understood by the general American public, is it?
No, I don't think so. In fact, there are so many urban legends that were generated almost instantly at that time and have prevailed ever since, even though there isn't a shred of evidence to support them, is really a pretty amazing thing. The fact is, ATMs never were going to go dark. There was not a remote risk at that time. If you go back and look at all of the investigations that have been done by congressional committees and journalists and academics and so forth, you know, the ATM going dark just wasn't going to happen. In fact, what really happened is there was a panic on the fifth floor of the Treasury building where the Secretary of the Treasury was surrounded by his Wall Street retainers that he had brought to the job from Goldman Sachs and elsewhere. And they were looking at something altogether different than the status of ATM machines around the country. They were looking at the ticker and the price of Goldman Sachs, where the S&P futures were, generally the market's instant reaction to the valuation of stocks and bonds on Wall Street. And they panicked because appropriately the market was marking down dramatically the value of all those hedge funds and all those pyramids of risk and debt that had built up over the previous 4 or 5 or 6 years since the dot-com bust. I think in my book, actually, The Great Deformation, I have a whole opening section where I try to go through that in great detail and one by one look at things like AIG. Did it have to be bailed out? No. Were its customers around the world for life insurance or property and casualty in danger of losing their protection or their coverage? Absolutely not. This was entirely a problem in the holding company that could have been liquidated, and the insurance subsidiaries would have been fine because they were regulated by the states and other government institutions around the world. Was there a risk that the money market funds were going to implode? Absolutely not, and I go through the detail of those. So I think the bottom line that I had on all of this is that the meltdown, so-called, the panic after the Lehman bankruptcy, was entirely a run on the wholesale money market in the canyons of Wall Street. It was not the 1930s all over again. It was not, there was no risk that there would be millions of people lined up at their local bank branch. It was entirely a meltdown in Wall Street. It should have been allowed to burn out there. Goldman would have been gone. Morgan Stanley would have been gone, the last 2 gambling houses standing, and that would have been for the better, because after 2 rocky months, the bits and pieces would have been reformulated and reorganized, and maybe there would be 5 sons of Goldman today who would be running much more prudent and disciplined operations, because they would be people who had lost their shirts, so to speak, when the Goldman went down in 2008. The unfortunate thing is that the received wisdom, the mainstream narrative, is so upside down, so full of error and myth and maybe even deliberate deception, that policy today is run based on an erroneous interpretation or memory of what happened in September 2008. And that's why we tolerate a banking system that isn't reformed. I took off after that yesterday or 2 days ago on Bank America, which so far has now settled $100 billion worth of claims and fines and penalties as a result of all of the malfeasance and incompetence and even criminality that has gone on there, and yet nothing has been done really about thoroughly rearranging and reforming the banking system. And I just used Bank America as an example, that 6 years after allegedly we were close to Armageddon, nothing has really changed. The same is true, and I'll hold it at that, but the same is true with the Federal Reserve. The firemen came in, flooded Wall Street with zero-cost money, and that's how Morgan Stanley survived. I mean, they were entirely insolvent in late September, but they had, of 2008, but they had $100 billion worth of different life support and credit lines from the Fed. And for what purpose? The world could do fine without Morgan Stanley. Why did they get bailed out in all of the bad signals and moral hazard that comes from bailing out gamblers? Why did that happen? The Fed, it basically jumped in. Those were all lines from the Fed. Bailed everything out, really blocked, prevented the market from doing its job of liquidating bad debt, of liquidating bad trades and bad gambles. It has continued along the same lines for the last 75 months. Zero interest rates for 75 months are of no value to the Main Street economy. It is a gift to the gamblers and traders on Wall Street because the overnight money they use to carry their positions, the so-called carry trades, or they buy, junk bonds and put them on repo, is costing them virtually nothing to carry their positions. They're collecting the spread, which is almost like running your own private printing press, and they have the solemn assurance from the members of the Open Market Committee, I call it the Monetary Politburo, that there's going to be no surprises, interest rates will stay at zero, or if we decide that we're going to change them, we'll give you months and months of warning so that you can adjust your gambling stakes accordingly.
It's some kind of a system, and I tell you where I want to probe a little bit more is the zero interest rate policy, because I find it quite amazing in that we've got an entire generation of people right now who would like to have interest income. Right? And they've saved all this money their entire adult life. They're in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s now, some centenarians, and they don't have interest income. And what's amazing is there doesn't seem to be any uprising about it. And I attribute that, and I'm curious your perspective, I attribute that to essentially the fear that came out of the fall of 2008 and then the bribe of the stock market. So it's kind of like, hey, be so afraid. You don't know what's going to happen next. You could lose everything. Then it's like, but hey, we're going to take interest income away from you, but don't worry, we're going to give you a big stock market run up. And the fact that there doesn't seem to be any outrage for people that need interest income, it's just amazing because we're really forcing people to spend down principal, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I don't see the outrage visibly, on the scene either, but it has to be smoldering throughout the length and breadth of America among the tens of millions of people who have tried to do the right thing over their working lives, save money, scrimp, but want to remain safe and liquid and are unwilling to go back into the stock market for good and substantial reason. People who have been through the dot-com bust and saw roughly $6 trillion of collective value lost in the stock market in 2002-01, or then saw it happen again in 2007-2008, another $8 trillion worth of market value basically was vaporized in 4 or 5 months, are hesitant to go back in for good reasons because they don't trust the regime, they don't trust the market, they're afraid that there'll be another plunge. So given that, what we have allowed the Federal Reserve to do, and this is way beyond their statutory remit as far as I'm concerned, we've allowed them to basically run a gigantic fiscal policy, a income transfer policy that wouldn't even get the time of day on Capitol Hill if someone had the nerve to bring it up. Namely, that the zero interest rate is generating a $250 billion annual transfer of income from savers and deposit holders, because, there's something like $8 trillion of deposits in the banking system, from them to the banks themselves. Their cost of deposits are running practically nothing. And of course, if you're a bank, your deposits are your fundamental cost of production. So this policy is arbitrarily transferring $250 billion a year from savers and depositors to the banking system because that is the Fed's policy to try to rebuild the profitability and the balance sheets of the banks. So that is one utterly inappropriate, and I would say even despicable way to fix the banking system, and that is to take it out of the hides of savers. In a blog I did the other day, I just said, take an example of someone who literally did scrimp and save over a working lifetime of 40 years, managed to come up with $250,000 of savings, wants to keep those savings, liquid and safe in bank CDs for the retirement years, unwilling to risk a lifetime of savings in another stock market bust, And what is the return being generated by that lifetime of effort? Well, actually 40 basis points at best, which amounts to about one cup of black coffee at Starbucks a day.
That's not an exaggeration at all.
No, I know it isn't. I mean, I just do the math on $250,000 of savings at 40 basis points, which is 0.4%. It's $1,000 a year. That's $275 a day. Okay, this is outrageous. 10 or 15 years ago, the same lifetime, savings nest egg would have produced $12,000 or $15,000 a year, enough to pay for your coffee, your groceries, and a few other things. So this is really a measure. It's kind of the heart of the issue, and that is that we have a rogue institution called the Federal Reserve that has taken its kind of rubbery, elastic statutory mandate, which, doesn't really have any meaningful substance or content to it. It just says, wouldn't it be nice if we have the lowest inflation possible, the highest employment possible, and a stable economy? Well, that really can mean anything, and they've interpreted it to mean whatever they want to do. And so the very idea now that here we are in month 73 of zero interest rates, they started in December 2008 on the heels of the crisis, that they're still equivocating and debating behind the scenes whether they dare let the interest rates go up by even 25 basis points is really astounding. And it's a measure of how far off the beaten path this institution has taken the country, the national economy. And I think it's the heart of the matter as to why there is so many dangers ahead in terms of the economy. Because when you have 7 years worth of zero interest rates, everything gets distorted in terms of pricing. Why is the stock market so high? Because the gamblers are buying stocks and funding their positions with zero cost money. Why is the bond market prices, why are they so high and the yield so utterly low today? It's not just because people are worried about deflation. It's because, again, the Treasury, let's say the 10-year Treasury, trading at about 2% today, is not simply owned by investors. On the margin, the Treasury bond is being priced by hedge fund speculators who rent the bond. They don't own it. And by rent the bond, I mean you buy $1 million worth of 10-year notes, and you borrow $950,000 in the repo market to fund it, and the repo is costing you 5 basis points, and the note is yielding 200 basis points, or 2%. You collect the difference, and you spend the rest of the day having fun. This is totally wrong. It has turned Wall Street into a gambling casino, and it is distorting pricing and what I call price discovery, honest price discovery based on the real world, not the artificial world created by the Fed. It's destroyed that completely. And what needs to be understood is that capitalism can't thrive, can't be productive, can't generate growth and jobs, rising living standards, and all the rest of the good things that people want if the pricing mechanism at the heart of it, which is the financial markets, the money markets, the debt markets, the equity markets, are not allowed to operate honestly, but are entirely manipulated, pegged, and artificially set by the central bank.
Usually when that type of scenario, what you've just described, exists, and I think we can all agree it exists, it's usually just a waiting game until some type of a reset or a calamity or a swan swims in of the color black. It's only a matter of time, isn't it?
Yes, I agree with that completely. The Fed can generate massive bubbles, and it can delude people into thinking it knows what it's doing, it's in control, that there is a put under the market, that there is no reason to be fearful that you're going to be rewarded if you buy on the dips, which is what the market does over and over. Here we are this morning, and we're back up close to 2090, which is this, the all-time high on the S&P. Yeah, we're right there on the S&P 500. The whole scam really depends on the traders and the robo-traders believing that the Fed has a safety net or a put under the market. Well, the problem with that is it seems to work for 2, 3, 4, 5 years running, maybe even in 7-year cycles. That's what happened from 94 to 2000, and then the whole dot-com thing, burst and splattered all over the floor. Then we had another 7-year run, and then another huge markdown or reset, or whatever term you want to use. And here we are now, about 7 years from the last peak, and we're about ready to have another reset. So it can only go so far, and you sort of finally bamboozle the last sucker into buying, and then the bids dry up, and there's nothing down below. And I think that is one of the great evils that has come out of this whole financialization of the economy and central bank-driven financial system.
David, since you have such a good perspective on this, I'd like to take this back historically, and I want to offer one thing that I really love about your work is that in the Great Deformation, you use phrases like the triumph of the warfare state, the triumph of the welfare state. So you're going to have people on the left and right that don't like you. And I figure that's a good place to be. When somebody has the left and the right not liking them, they might be talking some truth. And anyways, I would love to take maybe the remaining time we have. And I thought it was a fantastic blog post that you did. It was republished in some other places. And you laid out a thesis, and I'm going to let you describe it in detail, but you essentially said that, hey, I really think the 20th century was a big mistake. Woodrow Wilson, president, took us into World War I unnecessarily, and then ultimately the conclusion is the pain that we experienced in the 1930s was essentially paying back for World War I. None of that really needed to happen. And then what you make the case is you say, hey, and what this really shows us is that perhaps all of the Keynesian policies that came out following in the 30s really never needed to be there. And now some people might offer some criticism. They might say, hey, David, you connect all these dots and you can't really do this in hindsight. But I tell you what, it's pretty damn compelling when I read it in hindsight.
Yeah, I think if you go back and look at the great sweep of history over the last decade, last century, and then you focus intensely on what was actually happening in the crucial months of 1915 and 16 and early 17, you can identify the pivot point of modern history. And you can realize, one, that World War I was almost over before Wilson went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war, that both sides were bogged down in the trenches and had been a 500-mile front from the Flanders coast in Belgium all the way to the Swiss border across northern France. And without getting into all the details, my thesis is that at that point in time, after a big push in 1916 by Germany at the so-called Battle of Verdun, which failed, they were trying to break the will of the Allies, capture Paris and end the war. That failed. Then the Allies, the British and the French, made a counter thrust to break the deadlock in the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the bloodiest battles in history. That failed. At that point, the war was over. Both sides were nearly bankrupt, demoralized. The populations were becoming restless. The misery and mayhem that was happening in the trenches was now understood by the public and publics of all of the combatants, and it was time for the war to end. in a peace of what I say exhaustion and bankruptcy with no victors. The only reason that the world didn't end up that way and then dig itself out and rebuild itself country by country is that Wilson decided that it was his role in history, his destiny, appointed by God in some crazy way to intervene, bring the might of America's manpower and economy into the equation. There was really no interest involved. Both sides were equally bad. America's security and national interest was not threatened in any way. The German fleet was bottled up in the harbors and had been for 3 or 4 years. The German army was decimated. There was just no danger either way, so there was no cause for him to jump in. But when he did, it tilted the tide of war towards ultimately the Entente victory. The result was the Peace of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles. That was a peace of victors. That was a peace of retribution. And it laid the groundwork for everything that went wrong in the 20th century. Number one, had he not intervened, I argue that Lenin would never have pulled off the coup in November of 1917. We wouldn't have had the scourge of the Soviet Union, of Leninist, Stalinist totalitarianism that shaped the rest of the century. Number two, I argue that in a peace of exhaustion versus a peace of Versailles, Germany wouldn't have been carved up into little pieces with pieces and parts handed out to France and to Poland and to Italy and so forth. There wouldn't have been a German army demobilized, sent home, and abandoned that became the riffraff base of the Nazi movement. There wouldn't have been the great hyperinflation of 1923. There wouldn't have been the rise of Hitler and Nazis. There wouldn't have been World War II. I think you can really demonstrate that Hitler is a direct product of the Treaty of Versailles and the false victory that occurred because of U.S. entry. Well, obviously, you only need to think a little bit about a world where there was no Soviet totalitarianism from the left, there was no Nazi totalitarianism from the right, there was no World War II, there was no Cold War. Everything would have been different, and obviously much for the better. The second point I make is that everybody was bankrupt as a result of the extension of the war until the end of 1918. It's obvious to me that the Great Depression that should have happened after the war, as countries had to deal with their enormous war debts and they had to deal with currencies that had been unhooked from gold, had permitted huge inflations of wages and prices and costs and so forth in domestic economies. Had there been a proper working out of that right after the war, the Great Depression of the 1930s wouldn't have happened. But instead, the central banks got enlisted to fund their governments, particularly the Central Bank of Britain and the Central Bank of the United States. They prolonged the adjustment in the 1920s and managed to actually generate a boom, the so-called Roaring Twenties, and ultimately the crash that occurred in 1929. There is a lot of more detail to all of this, but I think the shorthand statement is that the crash of 29 was an artificial consequence of a bubble created by the central banks in the 1920s as they struggled to deal with the aftermath of World War I. That bubble broke. It spilled out onto the world economy. It led to the Great Depression. And out of the Great Depression came the erroneous conclusion that there was some inherent flaw of capitalism that needed to be constantly managed and adjusted and compensated for by activist fiscal and monetary policy. In other words, the Keynesian predicate came out of the false conclusions about the cause of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the aftermath of World War I. It was not the inherent flaw of capitalism. So put all that together, and you now, 70 or 80 years later, have a warfare state that grew out of the Cold War, and that grew out of World War II. It never went away when it should have, when the Cold War ended in 1991, and that's why we have all of the wars of invasion and occupation and everything else going on today. Out of that came the welfare state from the 1930s. Out of that came activist macroeconomic management in a Keynesian fashion by both the fiscal authorities and the central bank. Put all that together, and it more or less gives you the shape, what I call the Great Deformations that define the world of 2015.
David, you've got a fascinating take. I appreciate you taking some time today. I think people can read more on your blog, but it really is a fascinating take. And The Great Deformation is a great book. I mean, I don't know how much time you've spent researching. I mean, clearly you've got a wide handle on this subject area. I mean, there's a lot of detail here. And I think the through line that you have woven makes perfect sense. Now, that if we did not intervene in World War I, we don't know exactly what would have happened, but I think you make a great point but we do know what happened after we intervened.
Right. We do know that it was a sequence of developments, one upon the other, that took the world in a very bad place. I think if you look at things clearly, those were not inexorable. It wasn't inexorable that a little ragtag band, just to finish this off, was going to storm the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg and create one of the most vicious totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. That was a contingent event. That was driven by the fact that Russia was bankrupt, the monarchy failed, the Tsar was dead, there was chaos in Russia because the war was prolonged, and at that moment, the Leninists got their opportunity. The same is true with Hitler. I can't stress that enough, that the world that unfolded in the 20s would have been far different had there not been the Peace of Versailles, the reparations, the war guilt clause. You know, the worst thing about Versailles was not even the monetary effects or the fact that Germany lost 25% of its territory, or that all the agitation that then, so-called revanchist agitation that then occurred for a reunion back with the fatherland in the 20s and 30s. That's what Hitler thrived on. All of that was bad enough, but the heart of the Versailles Treaty was the so-called war guilt clause, where the Germans were forced to come to Paris, get on their knees, and say the entire war was our fault. With history, so clearly, dramatically repudiates that. It was everybody's fault. It was, in a totally unnecessary war. So I think the point is, we don't know what would have happened, but we do know that what did happen wasn't inexorable, wasn't inevitable, and that there were a lot of better possibilities. There were some more constructive forks in the road that weren't taken because of a very consequential decision made by one man. And it really was one man. When you go back and look at the history of that period, 1670, the country didn't want to go to war. Wilson himself ran in 1916 on a platform that said he kept us out of war. It was not that we were in any way threatened or injured. It was because Wilson had in his mind, and he was a great megalomaniac, historical dreamer, that he could remake the world if he had a seat at the table. And we went to the war and caused all the things that we've been talking about here so that Woodrow Wilson could earn a seat at the table. That's what he was naive and manipulated. That's what the British kept telling him. You want to shape the peace after the war, you've got to bring the might of America into the war. The guy fell for it, and it changed the whole course of history.
David, you have a fascinating take in politics, economics, finance. I appreciate you taking the time today. David Stockman's Contra Corner, easily found. David Stockman into Google, it pops right up. The Great Deformation is on Amazon. I highly recommend it. Whether you agree with David or not, it's going to cause you to think. I appreciate you coming on, sir. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.